Hi, everyone. If you are a listener to this podcast, you can disregard this message. Nothing has changed for you. If you are a watcher of this podcast, we had some massive and insurmountable technical difficulties with the recording of this session. My guest's video and audio just would not sync, and the ultimate workaround was to remove her video entirely. You will see and hear me. You will only hear her. We also had some problems with the transcription. So not all of the captions appear on the screen. And to work around this, I had to type in the captions manually, which means they flash on the screen very quickly and then go away. This happens 4 or 5 times during the episode. Most of the time, it's only for a few seconds, but there is one egregiously 25-second long part where the captions flash up and then disappear. If you don't use the subtitles or the captions, this won't be a problem. However, if you are using a screen reader, there may be points where you have to slow down the recording in order to be able to read the captions. Hopefully, we will not have these problems with the next episode. Thank you again for listening.
Booked in, then come take my hand. We're rebels with a paperback plan.
Welcome to Booked and Banned, the podcast, where we discuss essential literature that has faced challenges and censorship. I'm Naomi, your host. In this episode, we are discussing Sherman Alexie's The Absolutely True Diary of a Part-Time Indian. Our guest is Sue, whom I know through my book club at West Point. Sue, welcome to the podcast. Please tell our listeners a little bit about who you are.
Hi, I'm Sue. I'm a retired federal employee. I worked in the Department of Defense Schools for Dependents for 40 years. A lot of that career was in Germany, and I ended up at West Point, and that's where I retired. I'm currently living where I grew up in Northern Idaho.
Great. Thank you so much. Let's talk a little bit about the novel before we get into our discussion. This novel follows Arnold Jr. Spirit, a 14-year-old aspiring cartoonist living on the Spokane Indian Reservation. Born with congenital hydrocephalus and a variety of resulting medical complications, Junior decides to attend an all-white high school in the affluent town of Reardan to escape the cycle of poverty and hopelessness he sees on the res. The story utilizes a mix of prose and illustrations to navigate his experiences of identity, grief, and the complex bond between his two worlds. A consistent fixture on the American Library Association's top 10 most challenged books, the novel has faced removal attempts since its 2007 release. While early challenges focused on the, quote, vulgarity, unquote, and so-called anti-Christian content, recent efforts often label the book socially offensive due to its frank depictions of systemic poverty and racism. So, Sue, what specific elements of Junior's journey or the book's reputation led you to select this novel for our conversation today?
I chose this book because, as I said, I grew up in North Idaho, and the Spokane Reservation isn't that far away from me, but I really knew nothing about it. And I had heard of Sherman Alexie and some of his other books and thought it would be a good idea for me to learn as much as I can about what he was saying and perhaps more about the reservation and the people who are living there. I have always been interested in Native Americans. I was born in South Dakota. I have relatives living near reservations. My grandmother was a teacher on the Pine Ridge Reservation. Other relatives worked at Rosebud. And It's always been something that's been of interest to me.
I would say similar to you, I grew up in rural Nevada and we weren't close to a reservation. However, what we did have and what I was exposed to was at the time called an Indian colony. And I think the distinction between a colony and a reservation was that the colony was contained within the municipality of the town I was growing up in. Junior describes his life through the lens of his medical challenges, detailing experiences with seizures, speech impediments, and hyperdontia, as well as the emotional violence of poverty, using his cartoons to illustrate his physical vulnerabilities. Given that many challenges focus on the quote graphic unquote nature of the text, how does the inclusion of these visual drawings change the reader's relationship to Junior's suffering compared to a purely prose narrative?
I enjoyed his cartoons actually. And looking at them and thinking of this question, I tried to look at it a bit more in detail. And I think he can communicate a much broader range of ideas than he could just by writing the words. At least it conveyed more to me. An example would be when he compared a white high schooler to an Indian high schooler and going down from what type of shirt the white people might have had, what his was, the special Kmart, the specialty shoes that his classmates in Reardan might have had versus his purchased from a supermarket on special, carrying a book bag on the white side, a black trash bag on his Indian side. And I enjoyed looking at what he thought his parents might have been if their hopes had been realized, their ambitions. And his grandmother just telling us more details from little pieces of her captions all about the picture, just letting us know more about her specifically. And some of them were just, I would say, a pretty normal teenage reaction to dealing with all the issues that come with growing up, and in his case, growing up and trying to bridge cultures.
I liked the illustrations as well. I thought they did add to the text, just little spurts here and there that gave us a different idea than maybe what we had pictured, but was more of the reality that Sherman Alexie was trying to create using this novel. So I felt that the illustrations greatly enhanced the experience. And I liked some of his portraits in particular, like his sister who had moved away, and the little sayings from his grandmother, and some of her more indigenous focused ways of moving through the world, I thought were particularly wonderful. The book contains a passage where Junior reflects on the history of the reservation and the role of the church, which has led many school boards to flag the book for, quote, anti-Christian, unquote, sentiment. How does viewing this through the lens of historical displacement help us understand Junior's anger as a response to cultural erasure rather than a simple critique of faith?
I viewed it as he was telling us how his grandmother approached people and had traditional ways of accepting eccentricities is how it was phrased. But somebody who perhaps is out of step with the mainstream of for Indian culture, say, and honoring those people. If someone had seizures, were an epileptic, they might have become a shaman. Or if they were gay, they were viewed as having strengths of being a warrior and a caregiver all together. And that was an honorable thing. And Junior speaks of his grandmother going to Spokane and seeing the homeless people talking to invisible people. And she just accepted it and spoke to the invisible people just because she doesn't know that they don't exist. So why should she be less tolerant of someone who was different? And he says that that acceptance of differences, eccentricities, changed as the Christian religion came in and people were viewed as being out of step. They were judgmental and hateful toward anyone who was eccentric, as he would say.
I felt that it was interesting that he was doing this through the lens of his grandmother's experience. He doesn't really hit us with some of the actual erasure that happened of indigenous cultures that were perpetuated primarily by the Catholic Church, but also other Christian Protestant denominations in the United States, where the people in his grandmother's generation in particular were forced into boarding schools. Their hair was cut short. They were forced to learn English and to only speak in English in the hopes that they would forget their indigenous language. Sherman Alexie is not hitting us over the head with those facts, but they are there looming in the background. And I think in a way he takes a gentler approach to those ideas than perhaps a history book should do. But of course, this is also a novel. So I found that the erasure of Indigenous culture was kind of a ghost looming in the background. And maybe that's the way Sherman Alexie wanted it to be. What do you think?
Perhaps that's how he wanted it to be, but to me, in being more gentle in approaching it, I see it as less likely to raise red flags to the broader Christian community. And in looking at the timeline, this came out in 2007. Just yesterday on the news, I saw something popping up about a Salish school in Spokane. And so I read the article this morning to learn a little bit more about it. And in 2005, a person from from the tribe, but ranges from Spokane and Coeur d'Alene clear up into British Columbia. So she has some connections with Caldwell, which is yet another reservation, but with the same cultural ties. She'd gone to British Columbia to help learn the language, and so worked from 2005 to 2021 on getting the language. And the lady who was teaching all of this had been taken from the reservation to a boarding school. Her children, who are in their 70s now, were not allowed to learn the language. But this younger woman came through and was learning it. And now they're raised $15 million of the $17.5 million they want for the school. They broke ground. They have been learning the language, teaching young people, growing the traditional plants for medicine, and they have a whole range of things that they've done working to get grants and funding other things. I think there's a strong growth within the tribe, and perhaps his more gentle way of approaching it helped that be able to happen. The school is established on, I think it's about 3.5 acres, but it was given as a reparation from the Spokane Catholic Charities because of the boarding school situation. Some things that have been historic wrongs are coming to a more positive outcome at this point. And I don't know that his approach had much to do with it, but it at least stopped being absolute opposite sides of the issue.
I think you're right that we're seeing some progress being made so that there is some restoration to indigenous languages and education and ways of being, that this idea that indigenous cultures must assimilate had tried to stamp out. I, for one, am glad that they were unsuccessful, though I know it also caused a lot of pain and suffering, and I'm not sure that that could ever be made up for fully, but it is nice to see some progress. Critics often attempt to ban the book because of its unfiltered depictions of alcoholism, violence, and the high mortality rate on the reservation. From a broader literary perspective, what happens to the integrity of a library collection when we choose to sanitize the difficult realities of marginalized groups rather than allowing all students to engage with them safely through fiction.
I think we are causing a greater problem by not allowing access to these materials. I don't think it necessarily should come down to all students must read all varieties of issues that we've had within our nation's history. But by not knowing that such things exist, by not allowing students who are perhaps experiencing variations of those very same problems read about them and realize that it's not isolated to their own situation, by totally trying to have a one view of this is how life is and this is how it should be, I think we lose all sorts of possibilities of perhaps bettering the problem by preparing people to recognize it. I just think that we are better acknowledging, perhaps understanding and recognizing the problems that exist and ways that people overcome them. In addition to the violence and the poverty, all the issues, he also dealt with being an intelligent person who needed to seek education outside of the opportunities that were offered locally. And there are many stories or situations where it's an example of perhaps someone who was extremely smart but had no options or sought none. And I think those people also need encouragement to see there might be ways beyond their particular isolated situation in growing up.
I think you're right about opportunity. First of all, there are not enough opportunities and certainly not equal opportunities for children who are on Indigenous reservations, the way that there might be for children from more affluent communities. So I think that those opportunities need to be bettered. But during the time that this book is taking place, which was the 1990s, those opportunities were not there
Yeah.
for Junior and many of his compatriots. So he had to make his own opportunities. And I think that's one of the main reasons he wanted to go to the school in the neighboring white town where he would have access to better education than what was on the reservation. Though throughout the novel, Junior struggles with the feeling that he's a traitor for leaving the reservation to seek a Reardan education, a sentiment echoed by his best friend, Rowdy. How does the external labeling of the book as, quote, socially offensive, unquote, by outside critics complicate this internal community struggle over what it means to be authentically Indigenous?
I think it's very presumptive of people outside the culture to judge what is or isn't part of the culture. Although I think as Junior dealt with it, it was a changing situation. The story of the basketball games, and when he was facing his former team and had the whole crowd turning their backs against him, yelling against him, throwing things at him, that certainly would reinforce the traitor aspect of it. But later in the book, Rowdy talks about how he read that all of their tribes used to be nomadic and that there were people who traveled from place to place seeking better plants, better water. And Rowdy made the comment, not many of us are nomadic now, but you are. And that helped me think about Junior in his situation. He wasn't exactly fitting in his current reservation society, but what he was doing was seeking better options that could benefit all of them in the end. It's unfortunate that outside critics try to determine what is and isn't part of that culture. It lessens opportunities for the rest of society to learn about that specific branch by having arbitrary categories.
That socially offensive label by outside critics, I find that problematic. Like you said, who are we to judge? who are we, two white women who are discussing a book about an indigenous culture. But I think that we need to come at novels and all kinds of books about other people's experiences that are different from ourselves from a place of curiosity and wanting to learn more, which is what you did. And you and I both read this book for a book club, and you had picked the book, which I am grateful for because I had never read it. I had read some Sherman Alexie short stories, but hadn't realized he'd written a novel at all. And so
Yeah.
it was a pleasure for me to find this and to read it. But getting back to this idea of being socially offensive, who would we be to determine that? Or who would outside critics be to determine that, especially when the novel is portraying the truth of one Indigenous boy's experience of his world? And in some of the research, it does say that Sherman Alexie's own life may have entered into this novel. There seem to be some semi autobiographical details because Sherman Alexie himself went to a predominantly white high school in a neighboring town. And that's how he leveraged his opportunities into going to a university and eventually becoming a writer. But he's also a writer that has become representative of some Indigenous communities. I wouldn't say all, because I think that there are many voices. And I also think that we still have to take into account that this is just one person's experience of his life on a reservation, his life in an all white school where he's the singular person of color. It's not every person's experience on an Indigenous reservation. It's not every person's experience of being the only person of color, the only Indigenous person in a specific town or community or environment. Reading this helps us, especially because we came to it from a place of curiosity, helps us to understand how our lives may have been different and how a fictional character, at least, may be representative of some experiences that other people who are not like us have had and may still be having. So, all of that's to say, I don't think we can judge what's authentically Indigenous. I don't know that everyone who is Indigenous would be able to authentically judge everything that is or is not authentic, just because there are so many different Indigenous cultures in and of themselves and different
Yes.
experiences of the world. Despite the very heavy themes in this novel of grief and isolation, Junior relies on sometimes crude humor and self deprecation to endure his daily life. Why do you think censors often fixate on the quote unquote inappropriate language of these jokes while overlooking the fact that for a teenager in Junior's position, this type of levity is a vital tool for psychological resilience?
I keep coming back to when he spoke of the Christian church, but let's just say the broader society. Identifying something as objectionable is an easier way to categorize something or to identify a difference rather than looking for commonalities. And there's something in the political setting that we're experiencing now. There are a lot of different groups, many of them religious based, looking for ways to pull people together by pointing out something that is something to fear or something to object to. And by pointing that out, then you lessen the likelihood of groups looking and saying, well, that's just a commonality we have. I think for whatever reason, we've had an increase of finding things to object about and to find fault with and to, I won't say demonize in this situation, but to stoke fear and concern about people being different. And that means a problem for us. And it's unfortunate that our society is going in that direction. But I do think that it's an unfair pulling attention away from, as you say, the resilience that Junior has by employing his humor and self deprecation.
Well, I would also say there are very few teenage boys who I've experienced that have been completely appropriate, especially when there are no adults in the room or within hearing distance. I think some of this applies to teenage girls too, just in different ways. That kind of critique just seems ridiculous to me because these are teenagers. And they're going to have salty language because they are testing boundaries. That is what teenagers are trying to do. And maybe there are a few out there who would never curse. I've known some in my life that were very religious, and so they would never utter a curse word, and they always tried to treat people respectfully. But I think for the most part, this is not something that a lot of teenage boys really value. And it's more they're trying to figure out who they are in the grand scheme of things. And so they say inappropriate things, they make inappropriate jokes, they kid each other in very inappropriate ways. I think that this goes on a lot. And so I just don't find that critique very valuable because it's like trying to turn back the tide. This is just how teenagers are. Not just the boys, but the girls too. So, as we conclude, what perspective do you hope listeners carry with them regarding the importance of keeping Junior's voice accessible in schools and libraries?
I hope that people take being open to differences with them. I would hope that learning beyond whatever the mainstream projection of this is normal or this is the way to be, uh, that we understand the historic patterns and understand that survival and growth take many different patterns. But I hope that they can find the commonalities and see the strength, that even though the situation was dire in many instances, there was family support, there was love and understanding throughout the community, even though he was deemed a traitor in some ways by playing basketball for the other team. But there was the support when he lost his grandmother. There was that support. And I hope that people can take away that understanding and look to see perhaps how that might benefit them in their own community, their own lives.
I think that is a beautiful note to end on. Thank you, Sue, for coming on the podcast to talk to us about the absolutely true diary of a part-time Indian. Our next episode will be a discussion of Mouse by Art Spiegelman. Thank you for joining us. As Isaac Asimov said, any book worth banning is a book worth reading.
Booked and banned and bound by pages, stories hiding through the ages, whispered truths that still ring clear for those who choose to listen here.